A friend in need. For 30 years now I have been studying my fellow men. I do not know very much about them. I suppose it is on the face that for the most part we judge the persons we meet. We draw our conclusions from the shape of the jaw, the look in the eyes, the shape of the mouth. I shrug my shoulders when people tell me that their first impressions of a person are always right. For my own part, I find that the longer I know people, the more they puzzle me. My oldest friends are just those of whom I can say that I don't know anything about them. These thoughts have occurred to me because I read in this morning's paper that Edward Burton had died at Cobh. He was a merchant, and he had been in Japan for many years. I knew him very little, but he interested me because once he gave me a great surprise. If I had not heard the story from his own lips, I should never have believed that he was capable of such an action. It was the more startling because both his appearance and his manner gave the impression of a very different man. He was a tiny little fellow, very slender, with white hair, a red face much wrinkled, and blue eyes. I suppose he was about 60 when I knew him. He was always neatly and quietly dressed in accordance with his age and station. Though his office were in Cobh, Burton often came down to Yokohama. I happened on one occasion to be spending a few days there, waiting for a ship, and I was introduced to him at the British Club. We played bridge together. He played a good game and a generous one. He didn't talk very much, either then or later when we were having drinks, but what he said was sensible. He had a quiet, dry humor. He seemed to be popular at the club, and afterwards, when he had gone, they described him as one of the best. It happened that we were both staying at the Grand Hotel, and next day he asked me to dine with him. I met his wife, fat, elderly, and smiling, and his 2 daughters. It was evidently a united and loving family. I think the chief thing that struck me about Burton was his kindliness. There was something very pleasing in his mild blue eyes. His voice was gentle. You could not imagine that he could raise it in anger. His smile was kind. He was a man who attracted you because you felt in him a real love for his fellows. He had charm, but there was nothing sentimental about him. He liked his game of cards and his cocktail. He could tell a good and spicy story, and in his youth he had been something of an athlete. He was a rich man, and he had made every penny himself. I suppose one thing that made you like him was that he was so small and frail. He aroused your instincts of protection. You felt that he would not hurt a fly. One afternoon I was sitting in the lounge of the Grand Hotel. From the windows you had an excellent view of the harbor with its crowded traffic. There were great liners, merchant ships of all notions, junks and boats sailing in and out. It was a busy scene, and yet I do not know why restful to the spirit. Burton came into the lounge presently and caught sight of me. He seated himself in the chair next to mine. "What do you say to a little drink?" He clapped his hands for a boy and ordered 2 drinks. As the boy brought them, a man passed along the street outside and seeing me waved his hand. "Do you know Turner?" said Burton as I nodded a greeting. "I have met him at the club. I am told he is a remittance man." "Yes, I believe he is. We have a good many here." "He plays bridge well." "They generally do. There was a fellow here last year, a namesake of mine, who was the best bridge player I ever met. I suppose you never came across him in London. Lenny Burton, he called himself. No, I don't believe I remember the name. He was quite a remarkable player. He seemed to have an instinct about the cards. It was uncanny. I used to play with him a lot. He was in Cobh for some time." Burton sipped his gin. "It's rather a funny story," he said. "He wasn't a bad chap. I liked him. He was always well dressed, and he was handsome in a way, with curly hair and pink and white cheeks. Women thought a lot of him. There was no harm in him, you know, he was only wild. Of course he drank too much. Fellows like him always do. A bit of money used to come in for him once a quarter, and he made a bit more by card playing. He won a good deal of mine, I know that. Burton gave a kindly little chuckle. I suppose that is why he came to me when he went broke. That and the fact that he was a namesake of mine. He came to see me in my office one day and asked me for a job. I was rather surprised. He told me that there was no more money coming from home and he wanted to work. I asked him how old he was. 35, he said. And what have you been doing before? I asked him. Well, nothing very much, he said. I couldn't help laughing. I'm afraid I can't do anything for you just now, I said. Come back and see me in another 35 years, and I'll see what I can do. He didn't move. He went rather pale. He hesitated for a moment, and then he told me that he had had bad luck at cards for some time. He hadn't a penny. He'd pawned everything he had. He couldn't pay his hotel bill, and they wouldn't give him any more credit. He was down and out. If he couldn't get a job, he'd have to commit suicide. I looked at him for a bit. I could see now that he was all to pieces. He'd been drinking more than usual, and he looked 50. Well, isn't there anything you can do except play cards? I asked him. I can swim, he said. Swim? I could hardly believe my ears. It seemed such a silly answer. I swam for my university. I was a pretty good swimmer myself when I was a young man, I said. Suddenly I had an idea. Pausing in his story, Burton turned to me. Do you know Cove? He asked. No, I said. I passed through it once, but I only spent a night there. Then you don't know the Shioya Club? When I was a young man, I swam from there round the beacon and landed at the creek of Tarumi. It's over 3 miles, and it's rather difficult on account of the currents round the beacon. Well, I told my young namesake about it, and I said to him that if he'd do it, I'd give him a job. I could see he was rather taken aback. You say you are a swimmer, I said. I'm not in very good condition, he answered. I didn't say anything. I shrugged my shoulders. He looked at me for a moment, and then he nodded. All right, he said. When do you want me to do it? I looked at my watch. It was just after 10. The swim shouldn't take you much over an hour and a quarter. I'll drive around to the creek at 12:30 and meet you. I'll take you back to the club to dress, and then we'll have lunch together. Done, he said. We shook hands. I wished him good luck, and he left me. I had a lot of work to do that morning, and I only just managed to get to the creek at 12:30. I waited for him there, but in vain. Did he get frightened at the last moment? I asked. No, he didn't. He started swimming, but of course he'd ruined his health by drink. The currents round the beacon were more than he could manage. We didn't get the body for about 3 days. I didn't say anything for a moment or two. I was a little shocked. Then I asked Burton a question. When you offered him the job, did he know that he'd be drowned? He gave a little mild chuckle, and he looked at me with those kind blue eyes of his. He rubbed his chin with his hand. Well, I hadn't got a vacancy in my office at the moment. Home. The farm lay in a hollow among the Somersetshire hills, an old-fashioned stone house surrounded by barns and outhouses. Over the doorway the date when it was built had been carved, 1673, and the house, grey and weather-beaten, looked as much a part of the landscape as the trees that surrounded it. An avenue of splendid elms led from the road to the garden. The people who lived here were as stolid, sturdy, and unpretentious as the house. Their only boast was that ever since the house was built from father to son, they had been born and died in it. For 300 years they had farmed the surrounding land. George Meadows was now a man of 50, and his wife was a year or two younger. They were both fine, upstanding people in the prime of life, and their children, 2 sons and 3 girls, were handsome and strong. I have never seen a more united family. They were merry, industrious, and kindly. Their life was patriarchal. They were happy, and they deserved their happiness. But the master of the house was not George Meadows. It was his mother. She was a woman of 70, tall, upright, and dignified, with grey hair, and though her face was much wrinkled, her eyes were bright and shrewd. Her word was law in the house and on the farm, but she had humour, and if her rule was despotic, it was also kindly. People laughed at her jokes and repeated them. One day Mrs. George stopped me on my way home. She was all in a flutter. Her mother-in-law was the only Mrs. Meadows we knew. George's wife was only known as Mrs. George. "Who do you think is coming here today?" she asked me. "Uncle George Meadows. You know, the one that was in China." "Why, I thought he was dead." "We all thought he was dead." I had heard the story of Uncle George Meadows a dozen times, and it had amused me because it was like an old ballad. It was touching to come across it in real life. For Uncle George Meadows and Tom had both courted Mrs. Meadows when she was Emily Green 50 years and more ago, and when she married Tom, George had gone away to sea. They heard of him on the China coast. For 20 years now and then he sent them presents. Then there was no more news of him. When Tom Meadows died, his widow wrote and told him, but received no answer, and at last they came to the conclusion that he must be dead. But 2 or 3 days ago, to their astonishment, they had received a letter from the matron of the sailors' home at Portsmouth, saying that for the last 10 years George Meadows, crippled with rheumatism, had been living there, and feeling that he had not much longer to live, wanted to see once more the house in which he was born. Albert Meadows, his great-nephew, had gone over to Portsmouth in the cart to fetch him, and he was to arrive that afternoon. "Just fancy," said Mrs. George, "he's not been here for more than 50 years. He's never seen my George, who's 51 next birthday." "And what does Mrs. Meadows think of it?" I asked. "Well, you know what she is. She sits there and smiles to herself. All she says is, he was a good-looking young fellow when he left, but not so steady as his brother. That's why she chose my George's father. But he's probably quietened down by now," she says. Mrs. George asked me to look in and see him. With the simplicity of a country woman who had never been further from her home than London, she thought that because we had both been in China, we must have something in common. Of course I went to see him. I found the whole family assembled when I arrived. They were sitting in the great old kitchen with its stone floor, Mrs. Meadows in her usual chair by the fire, very upright, and I was amused to see that she had put on her best silk dress, while her son and his wife sat at the table with their children. On the other side of the fireplace sat an old man. He was very thin, and his skin hung on his bones like an old suit much too large for him. His face was wrinkled and yellow, and he had lost nearly all his teeth. I shook hands with him. "Well, I'm glad to see you've got here safely, Mr. Meadows," I said. "Captain," he corrected. "He walked here, Albert," his great-nephew told me. When he got to the gate, he made me stop the car and said he wanted to walk. And mind you, I've not been out of my bed for 2 years. They carried me down and put me in the car. I thought I'd never walk again, but when I saw those elm trees, I felt I could walk. I walked down that drive 52 years ago when I went away, and now I walked back again. "Silly, I call it," said Mrs. Meadows. "It's done me good. I feel better and stronger than I have felt for 10 years. I'll see you out yet, Emily." "Don't be too sure," she answered. I suppose no one had called Mrs. Meadows by her first name for a generation. It gave me a little shock, as though the old man were taking a liberty with her. She looked at him with a shrewd smile in her eyes, and he, talking to her, grinned with his toothless gums. It was strange to look at them, these two old people who had not seen one another for half a century, and to think that all that long time he had loved her and she had loved another. I wondered if they remembered what they had felt then, and what they had said to one another. I wondered if it seemed to him strange now that because of that old woman he had left the home of his fathers and lived an exile's life. "Have you ever been married, Captain Meadows?" I asked. "Not me," he answered with a grin. "I know too much about women for that." "That's what you say," retorted Mrs. Meadows. "If the truth was known, I shouldn't be surprised to hear that you had half a dozen black wives in your day." "They're not black in China, Emily. You ought to know better than that. They're yellow." "Perhaps that's why you've got so yellow yourself. When I saw you, I said to myself, why, he's got jaundice. I said I'd never marry anyone but you, Emily, and I never have." He said it very simply, as a man might say. I said I'd walk 20 miles, and I've done it. There was a trace of satisfaction in his speech. "Well, you might have regretted it if you had," she answered. I talked a little with the old man about China. "There is not a port in China that I don't know better than you know your coat pocket. Where a ship can go, I've been. I could keep you sitting here all day long for 6 months, and not tell you half the things I've seen in my day." "Well, one thing you've not done, George, as far as I can see," said Mrs. Meadows, the smile still in her blue eyes, "and that's to make a fortune." "I am not a man to save money. Make it and spend it, that's my motto. But one thing I can say for myself. If I had the chance of going through my life again, I'd take it, and not many men can say that." "No, indeed," I said. I looked at him with admiration and respect. He was a toothless, crippled, penniless old man, but he had made a success of his life, for he had enjoyed it. When I left him, he asked me to come and see him again next day. If I was interested in China, he would tell me all the stories I wanted to hear. Next morning I thought I would go and ask if the old man would like to see me. I walked down the beautiful avenue of elm trees, and when I came to the garden I saw Mrs. Meadows picking flowers. I said good morning, and she raised herself. She had a huge armful of white flowers. I glanced at the house, and I saw that the blinds were drawn. I was surprised, for Mrs. Meadows liked the sunshine. "Time enough to live in the dark when you are buried," she always said. "How's Captain Meadows?" I asked her. "He always was a harum-scarum fellow," she answered. "When Lizzie brought him a cup of tea this morning, she found he was dead." "Dead?" "Yes, died in his sleep. I was just picking these flowers to put in the room. Well, I'm glad he died in that old house. It always means a lot to the Meadows to do that." They had had a good deal of difficulty in persuading him to go to bed. He had talked to them of all the things that had happened to him in his long life. He was happy to be back in his old home. He was proud that he had walked up the drive without assistance, and he boasted that he would live for another 20 years. But fate had been kind. Death had written the full stop in the right place. Mrs. Meadows smelled the white flowers that she held in her arms. "Well, I'm glad he came back," she said. "After I married Tom Meadows and George went away, the fact is I was never quite sure that I had married the right one."
Louise. I could never understand why Louise bothered with me. She disliked me, and I knew that behind my back she seldom lost the opportunity of saying a disagreeable thing about me. She had too much delicacy ever to make a direct statement, but with a hint and a sigh and a little gesture of her beautiful hands, she was able to make her meaning plain. It was true that we had known one another almost intimately for 25 years, but it was impossible for me to believe that this fact meant much to her. She thought me a brutal, cynical, and vulgar fellow. I was puzzled at her not leaving me alone. She did nothing of the kind. Indeed, she was constantly asking me to lunch and dine with her, and once or twice a year invited me to spend a weekend at her house in the country. Perhaps she knew that I alone saw her face behind the mask, and she hoped that sooner or later I too should take the mask for the face. I knew Louise before she married. She was then a frail, delicate girl with large and melancholy eyes. Her father and mother adored and worshipped her, for some illness, scarlet fever, I think, had left her with a weak heart, and she had to take the greatest care of herself. When Tom Maitland proposed to her, they were dismayed, for they were convinced that she was much too delicate for marriage. But they were not too well off, and Tom Maitland was rich. He promised to do everything in the world for Louise, and finally they entrusted her to him. Tom Maitland was a big, strong fellow, very good-looking and a fine athlete. He adored Louise. With her weak heart, he could not hope to keep her with him long, and he made up his mind to do everything he could to make her few years on earth happy. He gave up the games he played excellently, not because she wished him to, but because it so happened that she always had a heart attack whenever he was going to leave her for a day. If they had a difference of opinion, she gave in to him at once, for she was the most gentle wife a man could have. But her heart failed her, and she would stay in bed, sweet and uncomplaining, for a week. He could not be such a brute as to cross her. On one occasion, seeing her walk 8 miles on an expedition that she especially wanted to make, I remarked to Tom Maitland that she was stronger than one would have thought. He shook his head and sighed. No, she's dreadfully delicate. She's been to all the best heart specialists in the world, and they all say that her life hangs on a thread. But she has a wonderfully strong spirit." He told her that I had remarked on her endurance. "I shall pay for it tomorrow," she said to me in her melancholy way. "I shall be at death's door." "I sometimes think that you're quite strong enough to do the things you want to," I murmured. I had noticed that if a party was amusing, she could dance till 5 in the morning, but if it was dull, she felt very poorly, and Tom had to take her home early. I'm afraid she did not like my reply, for though she gave me a sad little smile, I saw no amusement in her large blue eyes. "You can't expect me to fall down dead just to please you," she answered. Louise outlived her husband. He caught his death of cold one day when they were sailing, and Louise needed all the rugs there were to keep her warm. He left her a comfortable fortune and a daughter. Louise was inconsolable. It was wonderful that she managed to survive the shock. Her friends expected her speedily to follow poor Tom Maitland to the grave. Indeed, they already felt dreadfully sorry for Iris, her daughter, who would be left an orphan. They redoubled their attentions towards Louise. They would not let her stir a finger. They insisted on doing everything in the world to save her trouble. They had to, because if it was necessary for her to do anything tiresome or unpleasant, her heart failed her, and she was at death's door. She was quite lost without a man to take care of her, she said, and she did not know how, with her delicate health, she was going to bring up her dear Iris. Her friends asked her why she did not marry again. "Oh, with her heart, it was out of the question," she answered. A year after Tom's death, however, she allowed George Hobhouse to lead her to the altar. He was a fine fellow, and he was not at all badly off. I never saw anyone so grateful as he for the privilege of being allowed to take care of this frail little thing. "I shan't live to trouble you long," she said. He was a soldier and an ambitious one, but he threw up his career. Louise's health forced her to spend the winter at Monte Carlo and the summer at Deauville. He prepared to make his wife's last few years as happy as he could. "It can't be very long now," she said. "I'll try not to be troublesome." For the next 2 or 3 years, Louise managed, in spite of her weak heart, to go beautifully dressed to all the most lively parties, to gamble very heavily, to dance, and even to flirt with tall, slim young men. But George Hobhouse had not the strength of Louise's first husband, and he had to brace himself now and then with a drink for his day's work as Louise's second husband. It is possible that the habit would have grown on him, which Louise would not have liked at all. But very fortunately for her, the war broke out. He rejoined his regiment, and 3 months later was killed. It was a great shock to Louise. She felt, however, that in such a crisis she must not give way to a private grief. And if she had a heart attack, nobody heard of it. In order to distract her mind, she turned her villa at Monte Carlo into a hospital for convalescent officers. Her friends told her that she would never survive the strain. "Of course it will kill me," she said. "I know that. But what does it matter? I must do my bit." It didn't kill her. She had the time of her life. There was no convalescent home in France that was more popular. I met her by chance in Paris. She was lunching at a restaurant with a tall and very handsome young Frenchman. She explained that she was there on business connected with the hospital. She told me that the officers were very charming to her. They knew how delicate she was, and they wouldn't let her do a single thing. They took care of her, well, as though they were all her husbands. She sighed. "Poor George, who would ever have thought that I, with my heart, should survive him?" "And poor Tom," I said. I don't know why she didn't like my saying that. She gave me her melancholy smile, and her beautiful eyes filled with tears. "You always speak as though you grudged me the few years that I can expect to live. By the way, your heart's much better, isn't it?" "It'll never be better. I saw a specialist this morning, and he said I must be prepared for the worst." "Oh, well, you've been prepared for that for nearly 20 years now, haven't you?" When the war came to an end, Louise settled in London. She was now a woman of over 40, thin and frail still, with large eyes and pale cheeks, but she did not look a day more than 25. Iris, who had been at school and was now grown up, came to live with her. "She'll take care of me," said Louise. "Of course, it'll be hard on her to live with such a great invalid as I am, but it can only be for such a little while. I'm sure she won't mind." Iris was a nice girl. She had been brought up with the knowledge that her mother's health was very weak. As a child, she had never been allowed to make a noise. She had always realized that her mother must on no account be upset, and though Louise told her now that she would not hear of her sacrificing herself for a tiresome old woman, the girl simply would not listen. With a sigh, her mother let her do a great deal. "It pleases the child to think she's making herself useful," she said. "Don't you think she ought to go out more?" I asked. "That's what I'm always telling her. I can't get her to enjoy herself. Heaven knows I never want anyone to give up their pleasures on my account." And Iris, when I talked to her about it, said, "Poor dear mother, she wants me to go and stay with friends and go to parties, but the moment I start off anywhere, she has one of her heart attacks, so I much prefer to stay at home." But presently she fell in love. A young friend of mine, a very good lad, asked her to marry him, and she consented. I liked the child, and was glad that she would be given at last the chance to lead a life of her own. But one day the young man came to me in great distress, and told me that the marriage was postponed for an indefinite time. Iris felt that she could not desert her mother. Of course, it was really no business of mine, but I made the opportunity to go and see Louise. She was always glad to receive her friends at tea-time. "Well, I hear that Iris isn't going to be married," I said after a while. "I don't know about that. She's not going to be married as soon as I wished. I've begged her on my bended knees not to consider me, but she absolutely refuses to leave me." "Don't you think it's rather hard on her?" "Dreadfully. Of course, it can only be for a few months, but I hate the thought of anyone sacrificing themselves for me. My dear Louise, you've buried 2 husbands. I can't see why you shouldn't marry at least 2 more. Oh, I know what you've always thought of me. You've never believed that I had anything the matter with me, have you? I looked at her full and square. Never. I think you've carried out a bluff for 25 years. I think you're the most selfish and monstrous woman I have ever known. You ruined the lives of those 2 unhappy men you married, and now you're going to ruin the life of your daughter. I should not have been surprised if Louise had had a heart attack then. I fully expected her to fly into a passion. She only gave me a gentle smile. My poor friend, one of these days you'll be so dreadfully sorry you said this to me. Have you quite decided that Iris shall not marry this boy? I've begged her to marry him. I know it'll kill me, but I don't mind. Nobody cares for me. I am just a burden to everybody. Did you tell her it would kill you? She made me. Nobody can make you do anything that you yourself don't want to do. She can marry her young man tomorrow if she likes. If it kills me, it kills me. Well, let's risk it, shall we? Haven't you got any pity for me? One can't pity anyone who amuses one as much as you amuse me, I answered. A spot of color appeared on Louise's pale cheeks, and though she smiled, her eyes were hard and angry. Iris shall marry in a month's time, she said, and if anything happens to me, I hope you and she will be able to forgive yourselves. Louise was as good as her word. A date was fixed, a rich trousseau was ordered, and invitations were sent. Iris and the lad were very happy. On the wedding day, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Louise, that devilish woman, had one of her heart attacks and died. She died, gently forgiving Iris for having killed her. The Bum. I had come to Veracruz from Mexico City to catch a ship to Yucatan, and found that, a dock strike having been declared the previous night, my ship could not put in. I was stuck in Veracruz. I took a room in the Hotel Diligencias overlooking the square, and spent the morning looking at the sights of the town. I wandered down side streets and peeped into quaint courts. I visited the parish church, which is very picturesque. Then I found that I had seen all that was to be seen, and I sat down in the coolness of the arcade that surrounded the square and ordered a drink. The sun beat down on the square and dusty cocoa palms mercilessly. Great black buzzards perched on them for a moment, flew down on the ground to gather some bit of offal, and then flew up to the church tower. I watched the people crossing the square. Negroes, Indians, Spanish, they varied in color from ebony to ivory. As the morning wore on, the tables around me filled up, chiefly with men who had come to have a drink before luncheon. I had already bought the local paper, but the newsboys tried to sell me more copies of the same paper. I refused 20 times at least the boys who wanted to shine my spotless shoes, and having come to the end of my small change, I could only shake my head at the beggars who gave me no peace. Little Indian women, each one with a baby tied in a shawl on her back, held out skinny hands to me. Blind men were led up to my table by small boys. Cripples exhibited their deformities, and half-naked, hungry children endlessly demanded coppers. But suddenly my attention was attracted by a beggar who, unlike the rest of them, and unlike the black-haired people sitting round me, had hair and beard of a red so vivid that it was startling. His beard was ragged, and his long hair looked as though it had not been brushed for months. He wore only a pair of trousers and a cotton singlet, but they were rags, dirty and foul, that barely held together. I have never seen anyone so thin. His legs, his naked arms, were skin and bone, and through the holes of his singlet you saw every rib of his body. You could count the bones of his dust-covered feet. He was not old. He could not have been more than 40, and I wondered what had brought him to this state. It was absurd to think that he would not have worked if he had been able to get work. He was the only one of the beggars who did not speak. He said nothing. He did not even hold out his hand. He only looked at you, but with such wretchedness and despair in his eyes, it was dreadful. He stood on, silently looking at you, and then, if you took no notice of him, he moved slowly to the next table. If he was given nothing, he showed neither disappointment nor anger. If someone offered him a coin, he stepped forward a little, held out his hand, took it without a word of thanks, and went his way. I had nothing to give him, and when he came to me, I shook my head and used the polite formula with which the Spaniards refuse a beggar. But he paid no attention to what I said. He stood in front of me for as long as he stood at the other tables, looking at me with tragic eyes. There was something terrifying in his appearance. He did not look quite sane. At last he passed on. It was 1 o'clock, and I had lunch. When I awoke from my siesta, it was still very hot, but towards evening a breath of air coming in through the window tempted me into the square. I sat down under my arcade and ordered a drink. Presently people began to fill up the tables in the restaurant, and the band began to play. And again bootblacks begged me to let them clean my shoes. Newsboys pressed papers upon me. Beggars demanded alms. I saw once more that strange red-bearded fellow, and watched him stand before one table after another. He did not stop before mine. I suppose he remembered me from the morning, and having got nothing from me then, thought it useless to try again. You do not often see a red-haired Mexican, and I wondered if he could be a sailor, English, Scandinavian, or American, who had deserted his ship, and by degrees had sunk to this pitiful condition. He disappeared. Since there was nothing else to do, I stayed on till I got hungry, and when I had eaten, I came back. I sat on till it was bedtime. I confess the day had seemed long, and I wondered how many similar days I should be forced to spend there. But I woke after a little while and could not get to sleep again. My room was stifling. I opened the shutters and looked out at the church. There was no moon, but the bright stars faintly lit its outline. The buzzards gathered on the cross above the cupola and on the edges of the tower, and now and then they moved a little. The effect was uncanny. And then, I have no notion why, I remembered the red-haired fellow again, and I had suddenly a strange feeling that I had seen him before. It was so vivid that it drove away from me the possibility of sleep. I felt sure that I had come across him, but when and where I could not tell. As the dawn approached, it grew a little cooler, and I was able to sleep. I spent my second day at Vera Cruz as I had spent the first. But I watched for the coming of the red-haired beggar, and as he stood at the tables near mine, I examined him with attention. I felt certain now that I had seen him somewhere. I even felt certain that I had known him and talked to him, but I still could recall none of the circumstances. Once more he passed my table without stopping, and when his eyes met mine, I looked in them for some gleam of recollection. Nothing. I wondered if I had made a mistake. But I could not get out of my head the impression that at some moment he had entered into my life. I was sure now that he was either English or American, but I was shy of addressing him. The day wore on. Another day came, another morning, another evening. It was Sunday, and the square was more crowded than ever. The tables under the arcade were packed. As usual, the red-haired beggar came along, a terrifying figure in his silence, his rags, and his pitiful distress. He was standing in front of a table only 2 from mine when I saw the policeman who at intervals tried to protect the public from all these beggars. He gave him a blow in the back. The beggar's thin body trembled, but he made no protest and showed no anger. He slowly walked away. Then suddenly I remembered. Not his name, that escaped me still, but everything else. He must have recognized me, for I have not changed very much in 20 years, and that was why after that first morning he had never paused in front of my table. Yes, it was 20 years since I had known him. I was spending a winter in Rome, and every evening I used it to dine in a restaurant in the Via Sistina, where you got excellent macaroni and a good bottle of wine. It was often visited by a group of English and American art students and one or two writers, and we used to stay late into the night, engaged in endless arguments upon art and literature. He used to come in with a young painter who was a friend of his. He was only a boy then. He could not have been more than 22. And with his blue eyes, straight nose, and red hair, he was pleasing to look at. I remembered that he spoke a great deal of Central America. He had had a job with the American Fruit Company, but had thrown it over because he wanted to be a writer. He was not popular among us because he was arrogant. He thought us poor fish and did not hesitate to tell us so. He would not show us his work because our opinion meant nothing to him. His vanity was enormous. He was so certain of himself that he infected some of his friends with his own assurance. I recalled his high spirits, his vitality, his confidence in the future. It was impossible that it was the same man, and yet I was sure of it. I stood up, paid for my drink, and went out into the square to find him. My thoughts were in a turmoil. I was aghast. I had thought of him now and then, and wondered what had become of him. I never imagined that he could come to this dreadful state. This was awful. I asked myself what had happened. What disappointments shattered him and broke his spirit? What lost illusions ground him to the dust? I asked myself if nothing could be done. I walked around the square. He was not in the arcades. There was no hope of finding him in the crowd that circled around the bandstand. Evening was coming on, and I was afraid I had lost him. Then I passed the church and saw him sitting on the steps. I cannot describe what a pitiful object he looked. Life had broken him, torn him limb from limb, and then flung him on the stone steps of that church. I went up to him. "Do you remember Rome?" I said. He did not move. He did not answer. He took no notice of me, as if I were not standing before him. He did not look at me. His blue eyes rested on the buzzards that were screaming and tearing at some object at the bottom of the steps. I did not know what to do. I took a yellow-backed note out of my pocket and pressed it in his hand. He did not give it a glance. But his hand moved a little. His thin fingers closed on the note and crumpled it. Then he made it into a little ball and suddenly flicked it into the air so that it fell among the screaming buzzards. I turned my head instinctively and saw one of them seize it in his beak and fly off. When I looked back, the man was gone. I stayed 3 more days in Veracruz. I never saw him again. The end of the flight. I shook hands with the skipper and he wished me luck. Then I went down to the lower deck, crowded with passengers, and made my way to the ladder. Looking over the ship's side, I saw that my luggage was already in the boat. It was full of gesticulating natives. I got in, and a place was made for me. We were about 3 miles from the shore, and a fresh breeze was blowing. As we drew near, I saw a lot of coconut trees, and among them the brown roofs of the village. A Chinese who spoke English pointed out to me a white bungalow as the residence of the district officer. Though he did not know it, it was with him that I was going to stay. I had a letter of introduction to him in my pocket. I felt somewhat lonely when I landed and my bags were put beside me on the beach. This was a far-off place, this little town on the north coast of Borneo, and I felt a trifle shy at the thought of presenting myself to a total stranger with the announcement that I was going to sleep under his roof, eat his food, and drink his whiskey, till another boat came in to take me to the place where I was going. But everything turned out all right. The moment I reached the bungalow and sent in my letter, he came out, a sturdy, ruddy, cheerful man of 35 perhaps, and greeted me with heartiness. While he held my hand, he shouted to a boy to bring drinks, and to another to look after my luggage. He cut short my apologies. "Good God, man, you have no idea how glad I am to see you. Don't think I'm doing anything for you and putting you up. The boot's on the other leg." and stay as long as you like. Stay a year." I laughed. He put away his day's work, saying that he had nothing to do that could not wait till tomorrow, and threw himself into a long chair. We talked and drank and talked. Towards evening, when it was no longer hot, we went for a long walk in the jungle and came back wet to the skin. We took a bath and then we dined. I was tired out, and though it was clear that my host was willing to go on talking straight through the night, I was obliged to beg him to allow me to go to bed. "All right, I'll just come along to your room and see that everything's all right." It was a large room with verandas on two sides of it and a huge bed protected by mosquito netting. "The bed is rather hard. Do you mind?" "Not a bit. I shall sleep without rocking tonight." My host looked at the bed thoughtfully. "It was a Dutchman who slept in it last. Do you want to hear a funny story?" I wanted chiefly to go to bed, but he was my host, and then I know that it is hard to have an amusing story to tell and find no listener. "He came on the boat that brought you here. He came into my office and asked me where he could find a place to stay for some time. I told him that if he hadn't anywhere to go, I didn't mind putting him up. He jumped at the invitation. I told him to send for his luggage. "This is all I've got," he said. He held out a little shiny black bag. It seemed a bit scanty, but it was no business of mine, so I told him to go to the bungalow and I would come as soon as I was through with my work. While I was speaking, the door of my office was opened and my clerk came in. The Dutchman had his back to the door, and it may be that my clerk opened it a bit suddenly. Anyhow, the Dutchman gave a shout. He jumped about 2 feet into the air and whipped out a revolver. "What the hell are you doing?" I said. When he saw it was the clerk, he collapsed. He leaned against the desk, breathing hard, and upon my word he was shaking as though he'd got fever. "I beg your pardon," he said. "It's my nerves. My nerves are terrible." "It looks like it," I said. I was rather short with him. To tell you the truth, I was sorry that I had asked him to stop with me. He didn't look as though he'd been drinking a lot, and I wondered if he was some fellow the police were after. "You'd better go and lie down," I said. He went, and when I got back to my bungalow, I found him sitting quite quietly, but very upright, on the veranda. He'd had a bath and shaved, and put on clean things, and he looked much better. "Why are you sitting in the middle of the place like that?" I asked him. "You'll be much more comfortable in one of the long chairs." "I prefer to sit up," he said. Queer, I thought. But if a man in this heat prefers to sit up rather than lie down, it's his own business. He wasn't much to look at, tall and heavily built, with a square head and close-cut hair. I think he was about 40. The thing that chiefly struck me about him was his expression. There was a look in his eyes. Blue eyes they were, and rather small, that I could not understand, and his face gave you the feeling that he was going to cry. He had a way of looking quickly over his left shoulder as though he thought he heard something. By God, he was nervous. But we had a couple of drinks, and he began to talk. He spoke English very well. Except for a slight accent, you'd never have known that he was a foreigner, and I have to admit he was a good talker. He'd been everywhere, and he'd read a great deal. It was a pleasure to listen to him. We had 3 or 4 whiskies in the afternoon, and a lot of gin later on, so that when dinner came, we were rather gay, and I'd come to the conclusion that he was a damned good fellow. Of course, we had a lot of whiskey at dinner, and I happened to have a bottle of Benedictine, so we had some liquors afterwards. I think we both got very drunk. And at last he told me why he had come. It was a strange story. My host stopped and looked at me with his mouth slightly open, as though, remembering it now, he was struck again with its strangeness. He came from Sumatra, the Dutchman, and he'd done something to an Chinese, and the Chinese had sworn to kill him. At first he thought nothing of it, but the fellow tried 2 or 3 times, and it began to be rather a nuisance, so he decided to go away for a bit. He went over to Batavia and made up his mind to have a good time. But when he'd been there a week, he saw the fellow hiding behind a wall. by God, he followed him. It looked as though he meant business. The Dutchman began to think it was getting beyond a joke, and he thought the best thing he could do was to go off to Surabaya. Well, he was strolling about the town one day when he happened to turn around and saw the Chinese walking quite quietly just behind him. It gave him a turn. It would give anyone a turn. The Dutchman went straight back to his hotel, packed his things, and took the next boat to Singapore. Of course, he put up at the hotel where all the Dutch stay, and one day when he was having a drink in the courtyard in front of the hotel, the Chinese walked in, looked at him for a minute, and walked out again. The Dutchman told me he was just paralyzed. The fellow could have stuck his dagger into him there and then, and he wouldn't have been able to move a hand to defend himself. The Dutchman knew that the Chinese was just awaiting his time. That damned fellow was going to kill him. He saw it in his eyes, and he went all to pieces. But why didn't he go to the police? I asked. I don't know. I suppose he didn't want the police to know anything about this thing. But what had he done to the man? I don't know that either. He wouldn't tell me. But by the look he gave me when I asked him, I suppose it was something pretty bad. I have an idea he knew he deserved whatever the Chinese could do. My host lit a cigarette. Go on, I said. The skipper of the boat that runs between Singapore and Kuching lives in that hotel between trips, and the boat was starting at dawn. The Dutchman thought it an excellent chance to get away from the Chinese. He left his luggage at the hotel and walked down to the ship with the skipper, as if he were just going to see him off, and stayed on the boat when she sailed. His nerves were in a terrible state by then. He didn't care about anything but getting rid of the Chinese. He felt pretty safe at Kuching. He got a room at a hotel and bought himself a couple of suits and some shirts in the Chinese shops. But he told me he couldn't sleep. He dreamt of that man, and half a dozen times he awakened just as he thought a dagger was being drawn across his throat. By God, I felt quite sorry for him. He just shook as he talked to me, and his voice was hoarse with terror. That was the meaning of the look I had noticed. You remember I told you he had a funny look in his face. And I couldn't tell what it meant. Well, it was fear. And one day when he was in the club at Kuching, he looked out of the window and saw the Chinese sitting there. Their eyes met. The Dutchman collapsed and fainted. When he came to himself, his first idea was to get out. This boat that brought you was the only one that gave him a chance to get away quickly. He got on her. He was quite sure the man was not on board. But what made him come here? Well, the boat stops at a dozen places on the coast, and the Chinese couldn't guess that the Dutchman had chosen this one. He only made up his mind to get off when he saw there was only one boat to take the passengers ashore, and there weren't more than a dozen people in it. I'm safe here for a bit at all events, he said. And if I can only be quiet for a while, I shall get my nerve back. Stay as long as you like, I said. You're all right here, at all events, till the boat comes here next month. And if you like, we'll watch the people who come off. He thanked me again and again. I could see what a relief it was to him. It was pretty late, and I told him it was time to go to bed. I took him to his room to see that everything was all right. He bolted the shutters, though I told him there was no risk. And when I left him, I heard him lock the door I had just gone out of. Next morning, when the boy brought me my tea, I asked him if he'd called the Dutchman. He said he was just going to. I heard him knock and knock again. Funny, I thought. The boy hammered on the door, but there was no answer. I felt a little nervous, so I got up. I knocked too. We made enough noise to rouse the dead, but the Dutchman slept on. Then I broke down the door. I pulled apart the mosquito curtains that were round the bed. He was lying there on his back with his eyes wide open. He was as dead as mutton. A dagger lay across his throat. And say I'm a liar if you like, but I swear to God it's true. There wasn't a wound about him anywhere. The room was empty. Funny, wasn't it? Well, that all depends on your idea of humor, I replied. My host looked at me quickly. You don't mind sleeping in that bed, do you? No, but I would have preferred to hear the story tomorrow morning. The Luncheon. I caught sight of her at the play, and in answer to her beckoning, I went over during the interval and sat down beside her. It was long since I had last seen her, and if someone had not mentioned her name, I do not think I would have recognized her. She addressed me brightly. Well, it's many years since we first met. How time flies. We are not getting any younger. Do you remember the first time I saw you? You asked me to luncheon. Did I remember? It was 20 years ago, and I was living in Paris. I had a tiny apartment in the Latin Quarter, and I was earning barely enough money to keep body and soul together. She had read a book of mine, and had written to me about it. I answered, thanking her, and presently I received from her another letter saying that she was passing through Paris and would like to have a chat with me. But her time was limited, and the only free moment she had was on the following Thursday. She asked me if I would give her a little luncheon at Foyot's. Foyot's is a restaurant at which the French senators eat, and it was so far beyond my means that I had never even thought of going there. But I was flattered, and I was too young to say no to a woman. I had 80 francs to live on till the end of the month, and a modest luncheon should not cost more than 15. If I cut out coffee for the next 2 weeks, I could manage well enough. I answered that I would meet her at Foyot's on Thursday at 12:30. She was not so young as I expected, and in appearance imposing rather than attractive. She was in fact a woman of 40, and she gave me the impression of having more teeth, white and large and even, than were necessary for any practical purpose. She was talkative, but since she seemed inclined to talk about me, I was prepared to be an attentive listener. I was startled when the menu was brought, for the prices were a great deal higher than I had expected. But she reassured me. I never eat anything for luncheon, she said. Oh, don't say that, I answered generously. I never eat more than one thing. I think people eat too much nowadays. A little fish, perhaps. I wonder if they have any salmon. Well, it was early in the year for salmon, and it was not on the menu. But I asked the waiter if there was any. Yes, they had a beautiful salmon. It was the first they had had. I ordered it for my guest. The waiter asked her if she would have something while it was being cooked. No, she answered. I never eat more than one thing. Unless you had a little caviar. I never mind caviar. My heart sank a little. I knew I could not afford caviar, but I could not tell her that. I told the waiter by all means to bring caviar. For myself, I chose the cheapest dish on the menu, and that was a mutton chop. I think you're unwise to eat meat, she said. I don't know how you can expect to work after eating heavy things like chops. I never overload my stomach. Then came the question of drink. I never drink anything for luncheon, she said. Neither do I answered promptly. Except white wine, she went on as though I had not spoken. These French white wines are so light, they are wonderful for the digestion. What would you like? I asked her. My doctor won't let me drink anything but champagne. I think I turned a little pale. I ordered half a bottle. I mentioned casually that my doctor had absolutely forbidden me to drink champagne. What are you going to drink then? Water. She ate the caviar and she ate the salmon. She talked gaily of art and literature and music. But I wondered what the bill would come to. When my mutton chop arrived, she said, I see that you're in the habit of eating a heavy luncheon. I'm sure it's a mistake. Why don't you follow my example and just eat one thing? I'm sure you'd feel much better then. I am only going to eat one thing, I said as the waiter came again with the menu. She waved him aside with a light gesture. No, I never eat anything for luncheon. Just a bite. I never want more than that. I can't eat anything more. Unless they had some of those giant asparagus. I should be sorry to leave Paris without having some of them. My heart sank. I had seen them in the shops, and I knew that they were horribly expensive. My mouth had often watered at the sight of them. "Madam wants to know if you have any of those giant asparagus," I asked the waiter. I hoped he would say no. A happy smile spread over his broad face, and he assured me that they had some so large, so splendid, so tender, that it was a marvel. "I'm not in the least hungry," my guest sighed. "But if you insist, I don't mind having some asparagus." I ordered them. "Aren't you going to have any?" "No, I never eat asparagus." I know there are people who don't like them. We waited for the asparagus to be cooked. Panic seized me. It was not a question now how much money I should have left for the rest of the month, but whether I had enough to pay the bill. It would be terrible to find myself 10 francs short and be obliged to borrow from my guest. I could not bring myself to do that. I knew exactly how much money I had, and if the bill came to more, I made up my mind that I would put my hand in my pocket and with a dramatic cry start up and say my money had been stolen. If she had not money enough to pay the bill, then the only thing to do would be to leave my watch and say I would come back and pay later. The asparagus appeared. They were enormous and appetizing. The smell of the melted butter tickled my nostrils. I watched the woman send them down her throat, and in my polite way I talked on the condition of the drama in the Balkans. At last she finished. "Coffee?" I said. "Yes, just an ice cream and coffee," she answered. It was all the same to me now, so I ordered coffee for myself and an ice cream and coffee for her. "You know, there's one thing I thoroughly believe in," she said as she ate the ice cream. "One should always get up from a meal feeling one could eat a little more." "Are you still hungry?" I asked faintly. "Oh no, I'm not hungry. You see, I don't eat luncheon. I have a cup of coffee in the morning and then dinner. But I never eat more than one thing for luncheon. I was speaking for you." "Oh, I see." Then a terrible thing happened. While we were waiting for the coffee, the head waiter, with a smile on his false face, came up to us bearing a large basket full of huge peaches. Peaches were not in season then. Lord knew what they cost. I knew, too, a little later, for my guest, going on with her conversation, absent-mindedly took one. "You see, you've filled your stomach with a lot of meat, and you can't eat any more. But I've just had a snack, and I shall enjoy a peach." The bill came, and when I paid it, I found that I had only enough for a quite inadequate tip. Her eyes rested for a moment on the 3 francs I left for the waiter, and I knew that she thought me mean. But when I walked out of the restaurant, I had the whole month before me and not a penny in my pocket. "Follow my example," she said as we shook hands, "and never eat more than one thing for luncheon." "I'll do better than that," I answered. "I'll eat nothing for dinner tonight." "Humorist!" she cried gaily, jumping into a cab. "You're quite a humorist." But I have had my revenge at last. Today she weighs 21 stone.
The Man with a Scar. It was on account of the scar that I first noticed him, for it ran broad and red from his temple to his chin. This scar spoke of a terrible wound, and I wondered whether it had been caused by a sabre or by a fragment of shell. It was unexpected on that round, fat, and good-humoured face. He had small features, and his face went oddly with his large and fat body. He was a powerful man of more than common height. I never saw him in anything but a very shabby grey suit, a hulky shirt, and an old sombrero. He was far from clean. He used to come into the Palace Hotel at Guatemala City every day at cocktail time, and tried to sell lottery tickets. I never saw anyone buy, but now and then I saw him offered a drink. He never refused it. He walked among the tables, pausing at each table, with a little smile offered the lottery tickets, and when no notice was taken of him, with the same smile passed on. I think he was the most part a little drunk. I was standing at the bar one evening with an acquaintance when the man with the scar came up. I shook my head as for the 20th time since my arrival he held out his lottery tickets to me. But my companion greeted him kindly. "How is life, General?" "Not so bad. Business is not too good, but it might be worse." "What will you have, General?" "A brandy." He drank it and put the glass back on the bar. He nodded to my acquaintance. "Thank you." Then he turned away and offered his tickets to the man who was standing next to us. "Who is your friend?" I asked. "That's a terrific scar on his face." "It doesn't add to his beauty, does it?" "He is an exile from Nicaragua. He is a ruffian, of course, and a bandit, but not a bad fellow. I give him a few pesos now and then. He took part in a rebellion and was general of the rebellious troops. If his ammunition hadn't given out, he'd have upset the government and would be Minister of War now instead of selling lottery tickets in Guatemala. They captured him together with his staff and tried him by court-martial. Such things are usually done without delay in these countries, you know, and he was sentenced to be shot at dawn. I think he knew what was coming to him when he was caught. He spent the night in jail, and he and the others, there were 5 of them altogether, passed the time playing poker. They used matches for chips. He told me he'd never had such bad luck in his life. He lost and lost all the time. When the day broke and the soldiers came into the cell to fetch them for execution, he had lost more matches than a man could use in a lifetime. They were led into the courtyard of the jail and placed against a wall, the 5 of them side by side with the firing squad facing them. There was a pause, and our friend asked the officer commanding the squad what the devil they were keeping him waiting for. The officer said that the general commanding the troops wished to attend the execution, and they awaited his arrival. "Then I have time to smoke another cigarette," said our friend. But he had hardly lit it when the general came into the courtyard. The usual formalities were performed, and the general asked the condemned men whether there was anything they wished before the execution took place. 4 of the 5 shook their heads, but our friend spoke. "Yes, I should like to say goodbye to my wife." "Good," said the general. "I have no objection to that. Where is she?" "She is waiting at the prison door." "Then it will not cause a delay of more than 5 minutes." "Hardly that, Signor General." "Have him placed on one side." 2 soldiers advanced, and between them the condemned rebel walked to the spot indicated. The officer in command of the firing squad, on a nod from the general, gave an order, and the 4 men fell. They fell strangely, not together, but one after the other, with movements that were almost grotesque, as though they were puppets in a toy theatre. The officer went up to them, and into one who was still alive emptied his revolver. Our friend finished his cigarette. There was a little stir at the gateway. A woman came into the courtyard with quick steps, and then her hand on her heart stopped suddenly. She gave a cry, and with outstretched arms ran forward. "Caramba," said the general. She was in black, with a veil over her hair, and her face was dead white. She was hardly more than a girl, a slim creature with little regular features and enormous eyes. Her loveliness was such that as she ran, her mouth slightly open, and the agony on her beautiful face, even the indifferent soldiers who looked at her gave a gasp of surprise. The rebel advanced a step or 2 to meet her. She threw herself into his arms, and with a cry of passion, "Soul of my heart," he pressed his lips to hers. and at the same moment he drew a knife from his ragged shirt. I haven't a notion how he had managed to keep it, and stabbed her in the neck. The blood spurted from the cut vein and dyed his shirt. Then he threw his arms round her and once more pressed his lips to hers. It happened so quickly that many didn't know what had occurred, but the others gave a cry of horror. They sprang forward and seized him. They laid the girl on the ground and stood round watching her. The rebel knew where he was striking, and it was impossible to stop the blood. In a moment the officer, who had been kneeling by her side, rose. "She's dead," he whispered. The rebel crossed himself. "Why did you do it?" asked the general. "I loved her." A sort of sigh passed through those men crowded together, and they looked with strange faces at the murderer. The general stared at him for a while in silence. "It was a noble gesture," he said at last. "I cannot execute this man. Take my car and drive him to the frontier. I honor you, Signor, as one brave man must honor another." And between the two soldiers, without a word, the rebel marched to the waiting car. My friend stopped, and for a little while I was silent. I must explain that he was a Guatemaltecan, and spoke to me in Spanish. I have translated what he told me as well as I could, but I have made no attempt to change his rather high-flown language. To tell the truth, I think it suits the story. "But how then did he get the scar?" I asked at last. "Oh, that was due to a bottle that burst when he was opening it. A bottle of ginger ale." "I never liked it," said I. The Verger. There had been a christening that afternoon at St. Peter's Church, and Albert Edward Foreman still wore his verger's gown. He kept his new gown for funerals and weddings. St. Peter's, Neville Square, was a church often chosen by fashionable people for these ceremonies. And now he wore only his second best. He wore it with pride, for it was the dignified symbol of his office. He took pains with it. He pressed it and ironed it himself. During the 16 years that he had been verger of this church, he had had a number of such gowns, but he had never been able to throw them away when they were worn out, and all of them neatly wrapped up in brown paper lay in the bottom drawer of the wardrobe in his bedroom. The verger was waiting for the vicar to have finished in the vestry so that he could tidy up in there and go home. "What's he hanging about for?" the verger said to himself. "Doesn't he know I want my tea?" The vicar had been appointed only recently, a red-faced, energetic man in the early 40s, and Albert Edward still regretted the last vicar, a clergyman of the old school, who never fussed, and was not like this new man who wanted to have his finger in every pie. Presently he saw the vicar coming up. "Foreman, will you come into the vestry for a minute? I have something to say to you." "Very good, sir." They walked up the church together, and the vicar preceded Albert Edward into the vestry. Albert Edward was a trifle surprised to find the two churchwardens there. He had not seen them come in. They gave him pleasant nods. "Good afternoon, my lord." "Good afternoon, sir," he said to one after the other. They were elderly men, both of them, and they had been churchwardens almost as long as Albert Edward had been verger. They were sitting now at a handsome table that the old vicar had brought many years before from Italy, and the vicar sat down in the vacant chair between them. Albert Edward faced them, the table between him and them, and wondered with slight uneasiness what was the matter. He remembered still the occasion on which the organist had got into trouble, and how difficult it was to hush things up. In a church like St. Peter's, Neville Square, they couldn't afford a scandal. On the vicar's red face was a look of resolute kindness, but the others had an expression that was slightly troubled. He's been trying to make them do something, but they don't like it, said the verger to himself. That's what it is, you mark my words. But his thoughts didn't appear on Albert Edward's face. He stood in a respectful but dignified attitude. He had been in service before he was appointed verger, but only in very good houses. Starting as a page boy in the household of a rich merchant, he had risen by degrees to the position of butler to a widowed peeress. Then, till the vacancy occurred at St. Peter's, he had been butler with 2 men under him in the house of a retired ambassador. He was tall, thin, grave, and dignified. He looked, if not like a duke, at least like an actor of the old school who specialized in duke's parts. He had tact, firmness, and self-assurance. The vicar began briskly. "Foreman, we've got something rather unpleasant to say to you. You've been here a great many years, and you've fulfilled your duties quite satisfactorily." The 2 church wardens nodded. "But a most extraordinary fact came to my knowledge the other day, and I felt it my duty to inform the church wardens. I discovered to my astonishment that you could neither read nor write." The verger's face showed no sign of embarrassment. "The last vicar knew that, sir," he replied. "He said it made no difference. He always said there was a great deal too much education in the world for his taste." "It's the most amazing thing I ever heard," cried one of the church wardens. "Do you mean to say that you've been verger of this church for 16 years and never learned to read or write?" "I went into service when I was 12, sir. The cook in the first place tried to teach me once, but I didn't seem to have the knack for it, and later on I never seemed to have the time. I've never really found the want of it." "But don't you want to know the news?" said the other church warden. "Don't you ever want to write a letter?" "No, sir, I seem to manage very well without. Now they've all these pictures in the papers, so I know what's going on pretty well. If I want to write a letter, my wife writes it for me." The 2 church wardens gave the vicar a troubled glance, and then looked down at the table. "Well, foreman, I've talked the matter over with these gentlemen, and they quite agree with me that the situation is impossible. At a church like St. Peter's, we cannot have a verger who can neither read nor write." Albert Edward's thin, pale face reddened, and he moved uneasily on his feet, but he made no reply. "But couldn't you learn, foreman?" asked one of the church wardens. "No, sir, I'm afraid I couldn't, not now. You see, I'm not as young as I was, and if I couldn't get the letters in my head when I was a boy, I don't think there is much chance of it now." "We don't want to be harsh with you, foreman," said the vicar, "but the church wardens and I have quite made up our minds. We'll give you 3 months, and if at the end of that time you cannot read and write, I'm afraid you'll have to go." Albert Edward had never liked the new vicar. He'd said from the beginning that they'd made a mistake when they gave him St. Peter's. He knew his value, and now he straightened himself a little. "I'm very sorry, sir. I'm afraid it's no good. I'm too old a dog to learn new tricks. I've lived a good many years without knowing how to read and write, and if I could learn now, I can't say I'd want to." "In that case, foreman, I'm afraid you must go." "Yes, sir, I understand. I shall be happy to hand in my resignation as soon as you've found somebody to take my place." But when Albert Edward, with his usual politeness, had closed the church door behind the vicar and the 2 church wardens, he could not keep up the air of dignity any longer, and his lips quivered. He walked slowly back to the vestry and hung up on the peg his verger's gown. He sighed as he thought of all the grand funerals and weddings it had seen. He tidied everything up, put on his coat and hat in hand, walked out of the church. He locked the church door behind him. He strolled across the square, but deep in his sad thoughts he didn't take the street that led him home, where a nice, strong cup of tea awaited him. He took the wrong turning. He walked slowly along. His heart was heavy. He did not know what he should do with himself. He did not like the idea of going back to domestic service. After being his own master for so many years, he could not become a servant again. He had saved a tidy sum, but not enough to live on without doing something, and life seemed to cost more every year. He had never thought to be troubled with such questions. The vergers of St. Peter's, like the popes of Rome, were there for life. He sighed deeply. Edward was a non-smoker and a total abstainer, but he liked a glass of beer with his dinner, and when he was tired he enjoyed a cigarette. It occurred to him now that a cigarette would comfort him, and since he did not carry them, he looked about him for a shop where he could buy a packet of cigarettes. He did not at once see one and walked on a little. It was a long street, with all sorts of shops in it, but there was not a single one where you could buy cigarettes. "That's strange," said Edward. To make sure, he walked right up the street again. No, there was no doubt about it. He stopped and looked thoughtfully up and down. "I can't be the only man that walks along the street and wants a smoke," he said. "If some fellow opened a little shop here, he might make good money. Tobacco and sweets, you know." He gave a sudden start. "That's an idea," he said. "Strange how things come to you when you least expect it." He turned, walked home, and had his tea. "You are very silent this afternoon, Albert," his wife remarked. "I'm thinking," he said. He considered the matter from every point of view, and next day he went along the street and by good luck found a little shop to let. 24 hours later he had taken it, and a month later set up in business as a tobacconist and newsagent. His wife said it was a dreadful come down after being verger of St. Peter's, but he answered that you had to move with the times and that the church wasn't what it had been. Edward did very well. He did so well that in a year or so it struck him that he could take a second shop and put a manager in. He looked for another long street that hadn't got a tobacconist in it, and when he found it, and a shop to let, he took it. This was a success too. Then it occurred to him that if he could run 2 shops, he could run half a dozen. He began walking about London, and whenever he found a long street that had no tobacconist and a shop to let, he took it. In the course of 10 years he was running no less than 10 shops, and he was making money hand over fist. He went round to all of them himself every Monday, collected the week's takings, and took them to the bank. One morning, when he was there paying in a bundle of notes and a heavy bag of silver, the cashier told him that the manager would like to see him. He was shown into an office, and the manager shook hands with him. "Mr. Foreman, I wanted to have a talk to you about the money you've got on deposit in our bank. Do you know exactly how much it is?" "Not within a pound or two, sir, but I have a pretty rough idea." "Apart from what you paid in this morning, it's a little over £30,000. That's a very large sum to have on deposit, and it's better to invest it." "I don't want to take any risks, sir. I know it's safe in the bank." "You needn't have the least worry. We'll make you out a list of absolutely safe securities. They will bring you in a better rate of interest than the bank can afford to give you." A troubled look settled on Mr. Foreman's aristocratic face. "I've never had anything to do with stocks and shares, and I'd like to leave it all in your hands," he said. The manager smiled. "We'll do everything. All you'll have to do next time you come in is to sign the transfers." "I could do that all right," said Albert uncertainly. "But how should I know what I was signing?" "I suppose you can read," said the manager a trifle sharply. Mr. Foreman gave him a disarming smile. "Well, sir, that's just it. I can't. I know it sounds funny, but I can't read or write, only my name, and I only learned to do that when I went into business." The manager was so surprised that he jumped up from his chair. "That's the most extraordinary thing I ever heard." The manager stared at him as though he were a prehistoric monster. "And do you mean to say that you've built up this important business and made a fortune of £30,000 without being able to read or write? Good God, man! What would you be now if you had been able to?" "I can tell you that, sir," said Mr. Foreman, a little smile on his still aristocratic features. "I'd be verger of St. Peter's, Neville Square." The washtub. Positano stands on the side of a steep hill and is a very picturesque place. In winter its 2 or 3 modest hotels are crowded with painters, male and female. But if you come there in summer you will have it to yourself. The hotel is clean and cool, and there is a terrace where you can sit at night and look at the sea. Down on the quay there is a little tavern where you can have macaroni, ham and fresh-caught fish, and drink cold wine. On August, tiring of Capri, where I had been staying, I made up my mind to spend a few days at Positano, so I hired a fishing boat and rowed over. I arrived at Positano in the evening. I strolled up the hill, my 2 bags following me on the heads of 2 sturdy Italian women, to the hotel. I was surprised to learn that I was not its only guest. The waiter, whose name was Giuseppe, was an old friend of mine, and at that season he was boots, porter, chambermaid, and cook as well. He told me that an American signor had been staying there for 3 months. "Is he a painter or a writer or something?" I asked. "No, signor, he is a gentleman." Odd, I thought. No foreigners came to Positano at that time of year. I could not imagine anyone wishing to spend 3 months there, unless it was somebody who wanted to hide. And since all London had been excited by the flight earlier in the year of an eminent but dishonest financier, the amusing thought occurred to me that this mysterious stranger was perhaps he. I knew him slightly and hoped that my sudden arrival would not disturb him. "You'll see the signor at the tavern," said Giuseppe as I was going out. "He always dines there." He was certainly not there when I arrived. In a few minutes, however, a man walked in who could be no other than my fellow guest at the hotel, and I had a moment's disappointment when I saw that it was not the hiding financier. A tall elderly man, bronzed after his summer on the Mediterranean, with a handsome thin face. He wore a very neat suit of cream-colored silk and no hat. His grey hair was cut very short, but was still thick. There was ease in his bearing and elegance. He looked round the half-dozen tables at which the natives of the place were playing cards or dominoes, and his eyes rested on me. They smiled pleasantly. He came up. "I hear you have just arrived at the hotel. Giuseppe said that as he couldn't come down here to introduce me, you wouldn't mind if I introduced myself. Would it bore you to dine with a total stranger?" "Of course not. Sit down." He turned to the maid, who was laying a cover for me, and in beautiful Italian told her that I would eat with him. He made a very good cocktail, and with added appetite we began our dinner. My host had a pleasant humour, and his fluent conversation was agreeable. "You must forgive me if I talk too much," he said presently. "This is the first chance I've got to speak English for 3 months. I don't suppose you will stay here long, and I mean to make the most of it. 3 months is a long time to stay at Positano. I've hired a boat, and I bathe and fish. I read a great deal. I have a good many books here, and if there is anything I can lend you, I shall be very glad. I think I have enough reading matter, but I should love to look at what you have. It's always fun looking at other people's books. It also tells you a good deal about them," he said. When we finished dinner, we went on talking. The stranger was well read and interested in various topics. He spoke with so much knowledge of painting that I wondered if he was an art critic. But then he began to speak of the books he had read, and I came to the conclusion that he was a college professor. I asked him his name. "Barnaby," he answered. "That's a name that has recently become known to everybody," I said. "Oh, how so?" "Have you never heard of the celebrated Mrs. Barnaby? She is a compatriot of yours." "I admit that I have seen her name in the papers rather often of late. Do you know her?" "Yes, quite well. She gave the grandest parties all last season, and I went to them whenever she asked me. Everyone did. She is an amazing woman. She came to London to spend the season, and by George, her parties were the most successful in London. I understand she is very rich. Oh yes, very. But it's not the money that has made her success. Plenty of American women have money. Mrs. Barnaby has won her place in society by sheer force of character. She never pretends to be anything but what she is. She is natural. She is priceless. You know her history, of course. My friend smiled. Mrs. Barnaby may be a great celebrity in London, but in America she is almost unknown. I smiled also. Well, I'll tell you about her. Her husband appears to be a very rough diamond. He's a great strong fellow, she says, who could fell a steer with his fist. He's known in Arizona as One Bullet Mike. Good gracious! Why? Well, years ago, in the old days, he killed 2 men with a single shot. She says that even now he shoots better than any man west of the Rockies. He's a miner, but he's been a cow-puncher, a gun-runner, and God knows what in his day. A real Western type, said my professor, a trifle acidly, I thought. Mrs. Barnaby's stories about him are very amusing. Of course, everyone's been begging her to let him come over, but she says he'd never leave the wide open spaces. He struck oil a year or 2 ago, and now he's got all the money in the world. I've heard her keep the whole dinner table spellbound when she's talked of the old days and their adventures. It gives you quite a thrill when you see this grey-haired woman, not at all pretty, but wonderfully dressed, with the most wonderful pearls, and hear her tell how she washed the miners' clothes and cooked for the camp. When you see Mrs. Barnaby sitting at the head of her table, quite at home with princes of the blood, ambassadors, cabinet ministers, and the Duke of this and the Duke of that, it seems almost incredible that only a few years ago she was cooking the food of 70 miners. Can she read or write? I suppose her invitations are written by her secretary, but she is by no means an ignorant woman. She told me she had always made herself read for an hour every night after the fellows in camp had gone to bed. Remarkable. On the other hand, One Bullet Mike only learned to write his name when he got rich and had to sign checks. We walked up the hill to our hotel, and before separating for the night, arranged to spend the next day together. We spent a charming day, bathing, reading, eating, sleeping, and talking, and we dined together in the evening. The following morning, after breakfast on the terrace, I reminded Barnaby of his promise to show me his books. "Come right along." I accompanied him to his bedroom, where Giuseppe, the waiter, was making his bed. The first thing I caught sight of was a photograph in a beautiful frame of the celebrated Mrs. Barnaby. My friend caught sight of it, too, and suddenly turned pale with anger. "You fool, Giuseppe! Why have you taken that photograph out of my wardrobe? Why the devil did you think I put it away?" "I didn't know, signor. That's why I put it back on the signor's table. I thought he liked to see the portrait of his signora." I was staggered. "Is Mrs. Barnaby your wife?" I cried. "She is." "Good Lord! Are you One Bullet Mike? Do I look it?" I began to laugh. "I must say you don't." I glanced at his hands. He smiled grimly and held them out. "No, sir, I have never felled a steer with my naked fist." For a moment we stared at one another in silence. "She'll never forgive me," he moaned. "She wanted me to take a false name, and when I refused, she was quite angry with me. She said it wasn't safe. I said it was bad enough to hide myself in Positano for 3 months, and categorically refused to change my name." He hesitated. "Now I can do nothing but beg you not to disclose a secret that you have discovered quite by chance. I will be as silent as the grave, but honestly I don't understand. What does it all mean? I'm a doctor by profession, and for the last 30 years my wife and I have lived in Pennsylvania. I don't know whether I have impressed you as a roughneck, but I may tell you that Mrs. Barnaby is one of the most cultivated women I have ever known. Then a cousin of hers died and left her a very large fortune. My wife is a very, very rich woman. She has always read a great deal of English fiction, and her own desire was to have a London season, to give parties, and do all the grand things she had read about in the books. It was her money, and although the prospect didn't tempt me, I was glad she could gratify her wish. We sailed last April. The young Duke and Duchess of Hereford happened to be on board. I was ill when we sailed and stayed in my cabin, so Mrs. Barnaby was left to look after herself. Her deck chair happened to be next to the Duchess. My wife has a very keen sense of humor. Getting into conversation with the Duchess, she told her a little anecdote, and to make it more interesting, she said that it had happened to herself. The success of the story was immediate. The Duchess begged for another, and my wife went a little further. 24 hours later, she had the Duke and Duchess eating out of her hand. She used to come down to my cabin at intervals and tell me of her progress. It amused me greatly, and since I had nothing else to do, I sent to the library for the works of Bret Harte and supplied her with interesting details. I slapped my forehead. "We said she was as good as Bret Harte," I cried. I had a grand time thinking of the disappointment of my wife's friends when at the end of the voyage I appeared and we told them the truth. But I did not know my wife. The day before we reached Southampton, Mrs. Barnaby told me that the Herefords were arranging parties for her. The Duchess was crazy to introduce her to all sorts of wonderful people. It was a chance in 1,000, but of course I would spoil everything. She admitted that she had been forced by the course of events to represent me as a very different from what I was. I did not know that she had already transformed me into one-bullet Mike, but I had a suspicion that she had forgotten to mention that I was on board. Well, to make a long story short, she asked me to go to Paris for a week or two till she had strengthened her position. I didn't mind that. I liked the prospect of doing a little work at the Sorbonne, much more than going to parties in London, and so leaving her to go on to Southampton, I went to Paris. But when I had been in Paris 10 days, she flew over to see me. She told me that her success had exceeded her wildest dreams. It was 10 times more wonderful than any of the novels. But my appearance would ruin it all. Very well, I said. I would stay in Paris. She didn't like the idea of that. She said she'd never have a moment's peace so long as I was so near and might run across someone who knew me. I suggested Vienna or Rome. They wouldn't do either, and at last I came here, and here I have been hiding like a criminal for 3 endless months. Do you mean to say you never killed the 2 gamblers, shooting one with your right hand and the other with your left? Sir, I have never fired a pistol in my life. And what about the attack on your log cabin by the Mexican bandits, when your wife loaded your guns for you, and you stood the siege for 3 days, till the government troops came to your help? Mr. Barnaby smiled grimly. I never heard that one. Isn't it a trifle crude? Crude? It was as good as any Wild West picture. I suppose that is where my wife got the idea. But the washtub, washing the miners' clothes and all that. You don't know how she made us laugh with that story. Why, she swam into London society in her washtub. I began to laugh. She's made the biggest fools of us all, I said. She's made a pretty big fool of me too, remarked Mr. Barnaby. She's a wonderful woman, and you're right to be proud of her. I always said she was priceless. She realized the passion for romance that beats in every British heart, and she's given us exactly what we wanted. I wouldn't betray her for worlds. It's all very fine for you, sir. London may have gained a wonderful hostess, but I am beginning to think that I have lost a perfectly good wife. The only place for one-bullet Mike is the great open West. My dear Mr. Barnaby, there is only one course open to you now. You must continue to disappear. I am very much obliged to you. I thought he replied with a good deal of acidity.